The winter candlelight flickered in sharp, jagged patterns against the gilded walls of the Moore estate. It was a cold, unforgiving light that offered no mercy to the drawing-room, where Lydia Moore sat in her practiced shadow, her head tilted at a precise angle to ensure the heavy velvet drapes obscured the left side of her face. Much like the cracked porcelain vase on the mantel that her mother refused to discard but kept turned toward the wall, Lydia was a fixture of the house, present but never truly seen. At 22, she had mastered the exhausting architecture of the half-turned face, a silent choreography designed to keep her blemish from offending the sensibilities of a world that demanded perfection. She had learned to occupy the margins of rooms, becoming so still and unremarkable that she was treated as little more than a piece of faded furniture. Across the rug, the air was thick with the scent of smelling salts and sharp desperation. Her mother paced the floor, while her father stared at a mounting stack of creditors' notices, their voices clashing in a frantic duet of panic over the news that the dangerous Duke of Thornwick had come to claim the debt they could not pay. "You've just stepped into Heiress Diaries with Mayorskript. We believe every fortune has a story and every story has a hidden side. Subscribe to keep your seat at the table. You won't want to miss what we're revealing next week." The silence following the Duke of Thornwick's arrival was not merely an absence of sound, but a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against the walls of the Moore drawing-room. Edmund Blackwell stood in the threshold, his tall, well-built frame cutting a stark silhouette against the corridor's dim light. He did not wait to be announced. As he stepped forward into the glow of the flickering candles, the gasps from Lydia's parents were audible. His grooming was impeccable, his black tailcoat and crisp white cravat marking him as a man of supreme rank. Yet all eyes were pinned to the dark, jagged scar that slashed across his cheek. It was a brutal mark of history that seemed to mock the polished perfection of the room. Lydia remained in her shadow, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched from her tilted vantage point as Edmund's serious, restrained gaze swept over her father, who was currently trembling over a desk of unpaid debts. There was no dominance in the Duke's posture, only a terrifyingly calm discipline. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and had no patience for the pretenses of those who had only known silk. "The Moore family has a reputation for valuing their pedigree above all else," Edmund said, his voice a deep, resonant rasp that suggested a throat once tightened by smoke or injury. "Yet your ledgers suggest your pedigree is currently owned by the Crown and several less reputable lenders." Lydia's father swallowed hard, his face ashen. "Your Grace, we intended to settle." "You will settle nothing," Edmund interrupted, his eyes finally shifting toward the corner where Lydia sat. He lowered his gaze toward her, and for the first time in her life, Lydia felt a look that did not flinch or pity. His dark eyes locked onto the subtle line of the scar on her cheek, the delicate trauma she had spent years camouflaging. To her horror and fascination, he did not look away. Instead, his expression softened with a flicker of concealed tenderness that he did not share with her parents. "I have no interest in your land or your remaining jewels," Edmund said, his firm hold on his walking stick the only sign of his restrained power. "I require a duchess who understands that a mark of hardship is not a mark of shame. I am here to claim Lydia. In exchange, your debts will vanish as if they were never written." Lydia felt a strange, hollow calm settle over her. She rose from her seat, finally abandoning the velvet drapes that had been her fortress. As she stepped into the light, exposing her blemished side fully to the man society feared, he saw him bow his head slightly, not in mockery, but in recognition. He was a powerful noble carrying a visible burden, and in that moment of emotional exposure, she realized he was the only person in England who truly saw her. She was no longer a secret history. She was the Duke's demand. The carriage journey to the northern reaches of England was a blur of grey skies and rolling mist, ending only when the iron gates of Thornwick Hall groaned open to admit them. The estate loomed out of the fog like a medieval sentinel, a fortress of dark stone and towering battlements that seemed to scowl at the surrounding moors. As Lydia stepped on to the gravel drive, the air felt sharper, colder, and heavy with the scent of damp earth and ancient pines. The house was massive and Gothic, its windows gleaming like obsidian eyes in the pale light. It was a place designed for defense, yet as the heavy oak doors swung inward, the austerity of the exterior gave way to a world of quiet, unexpected luxury. Inside, Thornwick Hall moved with the precision of a clockwork masterpiece. There was no frantic scurrying of servants or the loud theatrical chaos Lydia had escaped at the Moore estate. Instead, the staff moved with a silent, rigid discipline, their footsteps muffled by thick Persian carpets. The entrance hall was lined with fine furnishings and extensive collections of art that spoke of a wealth so vast it had no need to shout. Everything was meticulously maintained, reflecting the disciplined nature of the man who ruled here. Lydia was led to a suite of rooms that felt like a sanctuary rather than a prison. The chambers were decorated in soft, welcoming tones that felt more like home than any corner of her father's house. A private study was connected to her bedchamber, its shelves filled with a curated collection of literature and history that aligned perfectly with the interests she had always kept hidden. Fresh flowers filled the vases, and a writing desk stood ready with fine paper and ink.
It was a world of contradictions, a fortress built of stone and shadow, yet filled with evidence of a deeply considerate hand. Lydia walked to the window, looking out at the manicured grounds that bordered the wild moors. For the first time, she felt the walls she had built within herself begin to settle. In this house of rigid discipline and hidden beauty, she realized she was not expected to disappear into the corners. Edmund Blackwell had not brought her here to hide her away. He had prepared a throne for the woman he had claimed from the shadows. Dinner was served in a smaller, more intimate dining room that bypassed the grandiosity of the great hall for the warmth of a crackling hearth. The table was modest, lacking the vast, impenetrable distance Lydia had expected from a man of the Duke's reputation. When Edmund appeared, he had discarded the heavy air of the intimidating noble, though his military bearing remained in the rigid line of his spine. He took his seat without a word, his impeccable grooming contrasting with the dark, severe scar that traced a map of old suffering across his cheek. As they began to eat, the silence was not the heavy, suffocating weight Lydia had known at the Moore estate, but a quiet, watchful stillness. For the first time, they sat close enough that the flickering candlelight spared no details. Lydia felt her habitual reflex, the tilt of her head to hide her own blemish, falter under his steady, dark blue gaze. "You continue to seek the shadows, Lydia," Edmund said, his voice a deep rasp that carried a strange, roughened gentleness. "But in this house, there is no need to camouflage your history." Lydia looked up, her pulse quickening. In the amber light of the fire, she saw the true extent of his damage. The scar on his face was darker and more severe than her own, pulling slightly at his eye and mouth in a way that spoke of fire or shrapnel. Then she realized the truth. The trajectory of his scar almost mirrored her own. Where hers was a delicate line of trauma, his was a jagged badge of survival. Yet they traced the same path across their skin. "We are mirror images, are we not?" she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. Edmund went still, his fork resting against the fine china. His single visible eye held hers with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. "You continue to seek the shadows, Lydia," Edmund said, his voice a deep rasp that carried a strange, roughened gentleness. "But in this house, there is no need to camouflage your history." Lydia looked up, her pulse quickening. In the amber light of the fire, she saw the true extent of his damage. The scar on his face was darker and more severe than her own, pulling slightly at his eye and mouth in a way that spoke of fire or shrapnel. Then she realized the truth. The trajectory of his scar almost mirrored her own. Where hers was a delicate line of trauma, his was a jagged badge of survival. Yet they traced the same path across their skin. "We are mirror images, are we not?" she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. Edmund went still, his fork resting against the fine china. His single visible eye held hers with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. "You continue to seek the shadows, Lydia," Edmund said, his voice a deep rasp that carried a strange, roughened gentleness. "But in this house, there is no need to camouflage your history. And they told me you were a monster who frightened children in the street," Lydia countered, a flicker of her hidden wit rising to the surface. A startled huff of laughter escaped him, transforming his scarred features into something approaching warmth. He reached across the table, his hand firm yet controlled, as he gestured toward the space between them. In that moment, the barriers of their shared trauma began to thin. They were two broken pieces that had finally found their corresponding half, recognizing in each other something worth remembering. The following week at Thornwick Hall was defined by a silence that Lydia slowly realized was not born of fear, but of profound mutual respect. She spent her mornings exploring the labyrinthine corridors, expecting at any moment to witness the beast her family had described. Instead, she found a household that moved with the quiet efficiency of a well-loved machine. She observed the way the head gardener spoke of the Duke, not with the trembling lip of a terrified servant, but a sturdy pride in the sprawling greenhouses Edmund had commissioned to keep the local village employed during the harshest winters. One afternoon, while she was tucked away in the library, she overheard a low conversation in the hall between Edmund and a young footman who had accidentally shattered a priceless Ming vase. She braced herself for the Duke's legendary temper, but the explosion never came. Instead, she heard the low, roughened rasp of Edmund's voice, devoid of the sharp ducal authority he wore in public. He was not concerned with the porcelain. He was asking if the boy had cut himself on the shards. The danger people spoke of was a facade, a suit of armor Edmund had forged from his own scars to keep a judgmental world at a distance while he fiercely protected the sanctuary within his walls. Later that evening, as the shadows lengthened across the stone floors, Lydia found Edmund in the conservatory, staring out at the darkening moors. He did not turn as she approached, yet he seemed to sense her presence. The air between them was thick with a new kind of understanding. She realized that his rigid discipline was a form of devotion to his home, to his people, and now, tentatively, to her. He was a man who had been broken by war, only to rebuild himself as a shield for those too vulnerable to stand alone. The fire in the library had burned down to a low rhythmic pulse of embers, casting the room into a deep amber twilight. Edmund sat in the winged chair by the hearth, the leather of his mask, which he had long since discarded in Lydia's presence, lying forgotten on the side table. For a long time, the only sound was the wind's mournful whistle against the stone battlements. Lydia stood by the window, watching the reflection of the man who had become her world. The silence between them had shifted. It was no longer a shield, but a bridge waiting to be crossed.
"It was not a duel, nor a simple accident of the field," Edmund said, his voice dropping to a roughened rasp that seemed to vibrate in the stillness. He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the dying flames. "The campaign at Waterloo was a cacophony of mud and screaming iron. My unit was caught in the path of a collapsing powder wagon. The world became fire and shrapnel in a single breath." His hand rose unconsciously to trace the jagged map of his cheek. "I survived the heat, but the man I was stayed behind in that trench. I returned to England a reminder of a war society wished to forget, a monster to be hidden away." Lydia moved then, her footsteps silent on the heavy carpet. She did not hesitate as she reached his side. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the defensive brace of a soldier expecting a blow. Instead of pulling away, she sank to the rug beside his chair. She looked up at him, her own scarred cheek fully exposed to the firelight, her posture calm and trusting in this moment of profound vulnerability. "You speak as if the fire took everything worth having," she said softly, her voice infused with a quiet resolve that made him finally turn to meet her eyes. "But the fire only revealed the iron beneath. You are not a reminder of a war, Edmund. You are the man who built a sanctuary for those the world discarded. You saw me when my own father looked right through me." She reached up, and though she felt him go absolutely still, she did not falter. She laid her palm against the scarred terrain of his face, her thumb tracing the ridge of damaged skin with a tenderness that was an invitation, not a pity. "You told me that a mark of hardship is not a mark of shame," she whispered. "I offer you my strength to hold that truth when your own memory fails you." Edmund closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as if a great weight were finally being shared. The silence of Thornwick Hall was no longer empty, it was filled with the promise of a future where neither of them would ever have to face their shadows alone. In the fading light, the Duke and his Duchess were no longer broken pieces, but a single unshakable foundation. The peace of Thornwick Hall was shattered by the arrival of a carriage bearing the Moore crest, its gilded doors disgorging Lydia's family and a pair of her former suitors, men who had once led the chorus of whispers regarding her unfortunate blemish. They entered the blue drawing room with a theatrical energy, their pastel silks and polished boots clashing with the sombre, ancient dignity of the estate. Lydia stood beside the window, her heart tightening as her mother rushed forward with arms extended, her eyes darting around the room to calculate the value of the Duke's furnishings rather than the welfare of her daughter. "My darling Derl," Lady Moore exclaimed, her voice thin and performative, "we have been simply besides ourselves with worry, wondering how you were enduring life in such a rugged environment." Beside her, Lord Wrexham, a man who had once told Lydia she was unsuitable for dancing, smirked as he surveyed the shadows. "Indeed, Lydia, one wondered if you had simply decided to hide away forever, given the company you now keep. It must be a relief to be among people of, shall we say, unmarred sensibilities again." The air in the room grew suddenly cold as Edmund emerged from the library. He did not wear his mask. He allowed his scarred features to be fully visible, his dark blue eyes hardening into an expression of chilling ducal authority. He moved to stand behind Lydia, his hand coming to rest at the small of her back in a gesture of unmistakable support. The vultures went still, the colour draining from Lady Moore's face as she confronted the dangerous Duke in the flesh. "I find it curious," Edmund said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. "You speak of sensibilities, Lord Wrexham, yet your presence here is a gross violation of them." Lydia felt a surge of strength she had never known, drawing it from the solid presence of the man at her back. She looked at her father, who was staring at Edmund's scars with a mixture of horror and greed. "You did not come for my well-being," she said, her voice steady and clear. "You came to see if the scarred monster was as terrible as the rumors promised, or if his fortune might be manipulated to further your own social standing." "Lydia, how can you speak so cruelly?" Lady Moore gasped, reaching for her smelling salts. "Cruelty," Edmund interrupted, his voice cracking like thunder, "is trading a daughter like livestock to settle a gambling debt. Cruelty is mocking the very woman whose resilience has more nobility than this entire room of unmarred fools combined." He stepped forward, his military bearing making the space feel impossibly small. "You have seen what you came to see. Now remove yourselves from my house immediately before I decide that social ruin is a far more appropriate punishment for your insolence than mere exile." The departure of the Moore family was a frantic, silent retreat. As their carriage vanished down the drive, Lydia turned to Edmund, seeing the lingering fire of protection in his eyes. For the first time, she did not feel like a victim of their cruelty, but a woman defended by a king. The spring tide brought with it a heavy vellum envelope enveloped with the seal of the Marchioness of Daventry. It was an invitation to the most prestigious ball of the London season, an event that usually signaled the height of social scrutiny and the cruelest of whispers. For years, such an invitation would have been a source of terror for Lydia, a summons to be mocked or ignored. Now, as she stood in the sun-drenched breakfast room of Thornwick Hall, she held the card with a steady hand, her thumb tracing the elegant calligraphy without the slightest tremor.
Edmund entered the room, his eyes immediately finding hers. He had spent the morning on horseback, and the cool air had lent a sharp clarity to his features, the dark scar on his cheek a stark reminder of his strength. He saw the invitation and went still, the familiar defensive brace returning to his shoulders. He had lived as a recluse for 5 years, burying himself in the north to avoid the flinching gazes of the ton. "The Marchioness is persistent," Edmund said, his voice a low, roughened rasp. "She sends these every year out of duty, never expecting them to be more than a formality to be declined." Lydia walked toward him, the soft silk of her morning gown whispering against the floor. She did not tilt her head or seek the shadows. "They expect us to hide, Edmund. They believe that our scars have made us small, that we are too broken to withstand the light of 1,000 candles." She reached out, her fingers brushing the cuff of his coat. "But we are not the people they remember. You are a war hero who built a sanctuary, and I am the woman who finally found her voice within its walls." Edmund looked down at her, his dark blue eyes searching her face. He saw the quiet resolve in her posture, the way she stood before him emotionally exposed, yet completely unafraid. The protective instinct that had governed his life for so long shifted. He no longer wanted to shield her from the world, but to stand beside her as she conquered it. "You wish to go," he stated, though it was not a question. "I wish to show them that we are not outcasts seeking mercy," Lydia replied, her voice ringing with a new, regal certainty. "I wish to attend as the Duchess of Thornwick beside the man who saw my worth when no one else would." Edmund took the invitation from her hand, his grip firm and controlled. A rare, slow smile touched his lips, softening the harsh lines of his face. "Very well. We shall give them a night they will never forget. We will not go to be tolerated, Lydia. We will go to remind them of what true nobility looks like." In the silence that followed, the decision felt like a vow. They were no longer the forgotten sister and the scarred duke. They were royalty preparing to reclaim their kingdom.
The grand ballroom of Daventry House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, a shimmering kaleidoscope of silk, jewels, and the sharp, expectant hum of the ton. When the Duke and Duchess of Thornwick were announced at the top of the grand staircase, the music seemed to falter, and a silence so complete settled over the room that the rustle of Lydia's muted blue gown echoed like a physical weight. Every eye turned upward, a sea of silent witnesses prepared to quietly condemn the couple they had labelled the Beast and the Blemish. Lydia stood beside Edmund, her hand resting on his arm, her chin held high as she surveyed the sea of astonished faces. She did not seek the shadows of the pillars, and for the first time she did not tilt her head to hide the delicate scar on her cheek. Beside him, Edmund was a figure of formidable authority, his military bearing rigid, and his scarred face fully visible, refusing the protection of a mask. The whispers began almost immediately, travelling through the crowd like wildfire, fragments of his face and the Moor girl. But as they descended into the fray, Lydia felt only the solid, unshakable strength of the man beside her. When the orchestra struck up the first notes of a waltz, Edmund led her onto the floor, and the crowd parted before them like a retreating tide. As he drew her into his arms, his hold was firm yet controlled, suggesting a deep, concealed tenderness that the spectators could not fathom. Lydia looked up into his dark blue eyes, seeing not the judgment of the room, but the man who had built a sanctuary for her spirit. As they began to move, Lydia allowed her eyes to close, drifting away from the weight of social scrutiny. The world of pastel gowns and biting whispers dissolved until there was only the rhythmic thrum of the music and the physical certainty of Edmund's lead. She leaned into him, her posture calm and trusting, emotionally exposed, yet entirely unafraid. They were two people who had been broken in different ways, now spinning in a private universe where their scars were no longer marks of shame, but maps of their shared resilience. The waltz was not a performance for the crowd, but a reclamation of their own worth. Leaning on each other's strength, they moved with a grace and genuine nobility that made the polished perfection of the onlookers seem hollow. In that moment of stillness, amidst the motion, Lydia realized that being truly seen and loved for exactly who she was meant the rest of the world no longer had the power to make her invisible. As the final notes of the waltz lingered in the air, Edmund did not release her. Instead, he remained in the center of the ballroom, his hand still firm and protective at the small of Lydia's back. The silent witnesses, who had waited for a misstep or a sign of shared misery, found themselves confronted by something they had not anticipated, an obvious, unwavering devotion. The whispers that had once been sharp and venomous began to soften, shifting from mockery to a quiet, stunned reverence. They saw the way the Duke's harsh features transformed when he looked at his Duchess, and the way Lydia touched his scarred cheek with a casual, fearless affection that rendered the damaged skin no different from any other. The era of their shame ended not with a grand speech, but in the simple, regal way they occupied the space together. Those who had initially recoiled from their scars now observed more carefully, noting the grace and genuine nobility that radiated from a couple who had nothing left to hide. Lady Moore and the discarded suitors watched from the margins, their social credit evaporating like mist as society realized that the Duke and Duchess of Thornwick possessed a substance the rest of the ton had long since traded for surface-level perfection. "You have silenced them, Lydia," Edmund murmured, his eyes lowering toward her with a tenderness that made the surrounding crowd vanish. They no longer see the blemish. They see only the woman who was brave enough to lead me back into the light. Lydia looked up at him, her eyes bright with the realization that she was finally, truly seen. The fortress she had built within herself had been replaced by a bridge, and the man standing upon it was the only one who had ever troubled himself to look closely enough to see her worth. She leaned toward him, her posture calm and resolve absolute. "We saved each other, Edmund," she replied softly. "I am no longer the forgotten sister, and you are no longer the monster of Thornwick. We are simply ourselves, and that is more than enough." As they walked together toward the exit, the crowd parted once more, not in fear, but in respect. The shadows of the Moore estate and the defensive walls of Thornwick Hall were behind them now. Ahead lay a future where their scars were celebrated as marks of survival, and their love was a testament to the beauty found in the most unexpected places. They had been two broken pieces that fit together to make something whole, and in the quiet way that matters most, they were finally free. If this story stayed with you longer than the video itself, you might belong here. Subscribe and keep walking these stories with us.